All right, so this is once again, notes toward a Metapoetics of Paranarratology 1, a 17-part reading, elaboration, and/or interpretation of David Antin's Varieties of Rhetorical Deception in Narrative and Non-Narrative Storytelling. This is once again Part 12, Danger, Deception, Delusion, Dramatikos, Eironicus, Dramatikos, anagnoreikos, Daulis toward Delphi, and Donald's December Declaration toward the Destruction of Democracy, to which we have been adding in America for clarification's sake, though it's not initially part of David's title for this section. And I had wanted to press on to Act 2, Scene 2 of Aristophanes' The Smile of the Sphinx. I'm not entirely certain that we will get to press on because I need to, narrate a dream that I had last night, and the dream, involves a set of corrections. But before I get to the dream, I'll provide an errata, for a different, set of errors that I committed, and an attempt an explanation of that set of errors, and then move on to the dream, which is more interesting and opens up a more interesting, discursive engagement with the idea of a metapoetics of paranarratology in terms of the making and correction of errors, and what it means to engage in error-full as opposed to error-free learning processes. So in the first set of errors, they're largely mechanical in a certain way and referential. And I noticed in listening to the recording that I made of my discussion, my discourse involving this section, this segment of our Part 12. I haven't counted how many Part 12s we have, but I'm aware at this point that there are quite a number of them. And that the possibility that we may never leave Part 12 has at this point has certainly occurred to me as perhaps the condition, right, of being confined, to a moment in a story, may have, occurred to some of the characters in Scheherazad's, recounting of the tales in 1001 Nights. But in any case, whether we ever, move beyond, Part 12, or not, I thought it might be useful to explain, some of the mechanics of some of the kinds of mistakes that I made in referencing the numerical values of these various acts that I referred to in The Smile of the Sphinx. And I noticed that in listening to it again, that if I intended, for example, to refer to Act 1, Scene 3, I would often refer to something like Act 1, Scene 1, or if I intended to refer to Act 4, Scene 1, I might refer to Act 1, Scene 1. And I believe that these types of errors belong to I've described before that I have a kind of continuum of cognitive difficulties that sometimes get described as specific learning learning disabilities, specific learning disabilities, and those learning disabilities get described with different terms, but there's a cluster of them that for me is less specific than it is a kind of continuity, and that constellation involves elements of dyslexia, elements of dyscalculia, and the most significant for me is dysgraphia. And since it's the most significant, I tend to lump that whole cluster and that whole continuum under the term dysgraphia, even though there's no educational or scientific taxonomy that allows that allows you to really do that, but I allow myself to do it because for me that term just becomes a nominal reference point from which I can articulate these various elements of cognitive difference that I experience, and that often becomes part of the narrational strategy that I use in creating representation, and is one of my significant interests, and that interest I tend to explore in terms of ideas like phenomenology and embodiment and positionality and social sortings, as well, and how those sortings, articulate us in relationship to, statuses and accesses that we have to, to culture and to, and that position us, in economic relationships to all forms of, discourses and domains of knowledge. So that being stated, the error, that or the set of errors that I kept making, identifying, attempting to identify a specific act and a specific scene within that act, and providing it with the wrong number, I believe is related to this difficulty that I have in one-to-one correspondence and sequencing, and I've referred to before as this problem in this problem that seems to belong to a specific kind of calculating problem, and I've talked about this before. For whatever reason, remembering sequences of numbers and sequencing numbers, as in counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and all types of bijective functions give me trouble. Adding and subtracting also give me more trouble than multiplying or dividing or performing more complicated mathematical operations, and so that set of errors, I believe, really belongs to that kind of unique cognitive disposition that I have, and without referring to it as a learning disability or something else, but I was curious. It was curious to me that I perform those sorts of errors so often in recounting the fairly complex narrative that is provided by Aristophanes' play The Smile of the Sphinx, and then keeping track more or less of all of the levels of narratological engagement that are also fairly complex, and one way of simplifying that complexity is thinking about it through a single vector, right? And say your vector is this idea of reading, elaboration, and interpretation, right? Then we can say about the narratology that I've been providing for this, that that I am providing a reading, an elaboration, and interpretation of David Antin's reading, elaboration, and interpretation. And then we can put this in brackets because I've claimed that it's not, entirely clear whether David is reading Aristophanes, singularly through Aristotle's reading in the second part of the Poetics in the comedy. But if that's the case, then and let's just go ahead and put that there, then we can say that I'm providing a reading, an elaboration, and an interpretation of David Antin's reading, elaboration, and interpretation of Aristotle's reading, elaboration, and interpretation of Aristophanes' reading, elaboration, and interpretation of the story of Oedipus in Greek mythology. And that's, a fairly multi-leveled and complex, set of articulations, to keep in mind. And so it struck me that it was interesting that there aren't, a significant amount of errors that I produce in keeping, all of those levels clear and well defined in my consciousness. And yet, when it comes to identifying, Act 1, Scene 3, it's very difficult for me to find that number, right? And or that set of numbers that identify both the acts and the scenes. So it seems to me like that is a self-demonstration of one of these conditions, right, that I refer to as this continuum, and often use simply the word dysgraphia, to describe it, but really it's this continuum of dyslexia, dysgraphia, and dyscalculia, and so that was the first set of errors that I wanted to address before moving on to, and let's see if I can state it. I really have to slow myself down to get it right, and it's interesting because I don't have to slow myself down, to think about these levels of interpretive engagement, but I really have to slow myself down to think about where we are in terms of acts and scenes and their simple numerical values, and so I'll slow down and say it. I really wanted to move on to Act 2, Scene 2, from what we engaged with in Act 2, Scene 1 on our last discussion. But before moving on to Act 2, Scene 2, from Act 2, Scene 1, and I'm not exaggerating here. I'm not exaggerating how much attention I require, my mind requires, to get the numbers right. Like, I really do have to pause and organize those numbers in my mind before I can, be certain that I'm getting it right. And I can visualize a kind of like terrain of the smile of the Sphinx. And if I think about Act 4, I'll create in my mind a visual space, and I'll organize the acts into a set of 4 segments, and they'll become these spatial domains. And then if I can see all of them in this representation, then then I'll recognize the last one as being 4. And then if I can, situate the scenes within those acts, also, visually within that spatial map, then I can situate the location of where an event occurs, and I can, specify, unless I'm making some other kind of error, which a different kind of error, which we'll get to when we get to the dream, but unless I'm making some other kind of error, I can utilize that map to name the act. But other than that, I can't neither acoustic memory nor a mathematico-conceptual memory will allow me to access, those numbers with any degree of certainty, and lack of confusion, unless I slow down and reconstitute that spatial map in my mind, and so that's one of the difficulties, and then when I think the other problem is keeping track of the expressions that David makes, and whether we're in sync with what we're doing or out of sync expressively. It's another visuals, spatial grid that I'm keeping track of, and so where that operation, even as I've come to learn how to use it as a tool, in ordinary circumstances, the intrusion of adding an extra dimension of relations that are visual, and that I'm performing out in in attempting to bridge the gap, between what could be seen as a dissociative, right, visual set of patterns, and the discourse that I'm producing. That extra attempt to synthesize, or perform, a set of confluences of meaning. I think, and I know, and maybe it's a set of incorrect assumptions, but I think also gets in the way of those skills and strategies that I've developed as a means of masking or getting around those sets of difficulties that I have given this dyscalculia, dysgraphia, and dyslexic continuity. All right, so that's the first set of errors, and that's a and that's a kind of metapoetic paranarratology of examining and accounting for them. And then I want to get on to a more interesting one, and a more interesting metapoetic paranarratology of accounting for it. So last night, Eric Havelock, or perhaps I should say, the ghost or the spirit of Eric Havelock appeared to me in my dreams, and obviously there are a number of reasons that Eric waited, until that moment to appear in my dreams. The first and obvious one is that we reached that point in the narration in which, we're directly engaging, not only dreams, which we engaged in from the very beginning in Act 1, Scene 1, with the various dreams that Tiresias has. But it wasn't until Act 2, Scene 1, in the dreams of Laius that the content of sleep, the Greek spirit of sleep, hypnos, and the various sons of sleep, that refer to different forms of dreaming, became part of the content of the dreaming itself, and so I believe that's one reason that it was last night that the spirit of Eric Havelock presented himself to me in a dream, carried by some son of Hypnos, other than Morpheus, the fashioner, and then the other reason I think is because of who Eric Havelock is, and one of the significant discursive focuses of Havelock's, which was the transformation of what was essentially an oral culture into a written culture, and the transformation, the transformation in Greek consciousness and mind, that movement, from orality to written culture, made. And that's there in his preface to Plato, but elsewhere as well. And it really becomes like a dominant keynote in the discourse that Havelock presents to us of his understanding of Greek culture, mind, and philosophy. And if you recall, in this dream that Laius has, and in which the spirit of the future Laius presents himself to Laius, he suggests that if Laius can't remember all of the details of the solutions to these various riddles that might be asked by the Sphinx, by Diarmenia Chesapeake, then he brings something along with him that he can write these answers, these solutions to these riddles on, and that he utilized whatever it is, whether it's a wax tablet or a piece of paper or an inscription on the back of his hand, he utilized these as cheat sheets, as notes, to answer correctly. And perhaps, perhaps Eric was waiting for that moment, or that confluence of the idea of dream, becoming part of the content, the thematic material, and the subject of the discourse, and this reference to writing, as an aid to memory. And in any case, it occurred to me, after the dream, that this might, be the rationale for waiting, because Eric could have come to me, much earlier with a list of some of the mistakes, that I had been, making. Although the first set, of corrections, couldn't have been made, until after, the last discussion. But that set, involved noting that I had referred to the Greek god of sleep as Somnos, and of course that's the Latin name for the Greek god of sleep. And Eric reminded me that the reason that I did that is that because my memory of the myth, right, of the 1,000 or 1,001, as I've been referring to them, sons of sleep, comes from Ovid and Ovid's Metamorphoses. And of course, in Ovid's Metamorphoses, Ovid refers to hypnos as in its Latin, in his Latin formation, as somnos. So that there could be a certain confusion on the part of my listeners, as a result of my own confusion, and so, Eric traces the inception of the error, to where it comes from in the telling of the story. So my memory of it, although I think about it, right, as part of the Greek, mythology, as part of that, domain that all of, these stories, come from, that, my only experience of this story comes from a Latin, a Latin recording that's later, translated into English, but that variously, refers to the players, the actors in these stories, with sometimes with their Greek names and sometimes with Latin names, and that my memory, in a certain way, divided itself in its understanding of this material as belonging to Greek culture, but then re-articulating it, as I had remembered it in Ovid, without consciously becoming aware that of all of those levels, right, of that we've been dealing with and being aware of in recounting our reading, elaboration, and interpretation of David Antin's reading, elaboration, and interpretation of Aristotle's reading, elaboration, and interpretation of Aristophanes. And in this instance, I was recounting and reading and elaborating and interpreting a reading, elaboration, and interpretation of Ovid, in which, one of the steps that I had failed to make, if you imagine these, keeping track of these levels as a series of as a kind of transformational grammar, and remembering to make and reverse, right, the account for the various transformations. I had failed to recall what level that I engaged this myth in memory on, right, and what plane that memory resided on, and it was a plane called Ovid's Metamorphoses, and the reason, even if I had known the story elsewhere, I perhaps would have been drawn to it because of the recounting of the 1,001 names in Aristophanes, and one can say, well, that necessarily represents an anachronism then, because Aristophanes wrote, prior to Ovid, and it could be regarded that way, if we regarded the account of the 1,001 sons, or the 1,000 perhaps sons of Hypnos, as being an invention of Ovid, but perhaps that it wasn't an invention of Ovid, but a retelling on Ovid's part of an idea that already belonged to the mythos logos, and that and that distinction, and which one is truth, which one belongs to Aletheia, we don't quite know, because one reason we don't know is because the Romans burned Alexander's library, and it's very possible that determining whether the 1,001 sons of Somnos, or the 1,001 sons of Hypnos, was an invention of Ovid's, or whether it in fact belonged to an idea that preceded the inventiveness of the Metamorphoses. It may have been determinable if all the volumes that were collected, by Alexander, remained to us today, and without that library, without that vast amount of lost material, we can only really speculate whether the idea that sleep, whether somnos or mythos, or sorry, that really was a parapraxis, not something else, but whether somnos or hypnos originally, right? That idea was originally a Greek idea or a later Roman idea. We can only really speculate now what the truth is regarding that. And if we speculate that the truth is that it's an invention on the part of Ovid in his Metamorphoses, then we have to say that the presentation of the 1,001 sons of Hypnos, which I misidentified as Somnos, in Aristophanes' The Smile of the Sphinx, is weirdly anachronistic, right? And perhaps represents an example of space-time travel. But if we imagine, and we very well could imagine, that this is the idea that Hypnos has 1,001 sons, that sleep has 1,001 sons that bring dreams, or other types of conscious figurations to those who sleep. If we imagine this was already a Greek idea, by the time it was adopted into the Metamorphoses, then the apparent anachronism disappears, and so in a certain way we can choose which truth we want to follow, based on the rationale and the reason behind our speculations, and particularly our speculations as they relate to this wealth of information, the Alexandrian library. All right, well, that's the first point, that Eric made, regarding some of these errors, but the more significant set of corrections, and the more significant discourse that we engaged in, really belong to my understanding and articulation of the form of the Smile of the Sphinx, and my argument that these various constructions of this movement of from ignorance to knowledge and truth represents a relationship to this idea of the divine feminine, and that it's pushed forward, through these, three constructs. And the first thing that it's kind of funny. The first thing that Eric Havelock noticed was that he said, well, first of all, you're pronouncing othisi wrong. It's like you're saying othisi and is othisi, and he says, on this one, your understanding of this word is relatively, it's reasonable. Like this word, othisi can mean, push, impetus, impulse, thrust, and you're using it to describe these dreams that these characters have. And clearly these dreams are motivators, right? And so I don't really have any, problem with that. And then he says, the second word that you're using, and that you also mispronounce, and you mispronounce as analipsy, and I don't know where you're getting this idea, but this is the Greek word. This is the word that the Greeks used to refer to the ascent of Christ, and you're using it you're using it in this curious sort of way, in which you seem to be defining the term as like an embarking or an undertaking. And then before I talk about maybe why you're doing that, or we have a discussion of why you might be doing that and how you misuse this word, let's talk about the last word. And you're mispronouncing that one too. You're pronouncing it anavasi, and it's anavasi. The accent is on the second A, or the second, the second syllable here, and that's okay in a way for what you're trying to get at. That word in Greek, means basically, it means climbing, or ascending, or but what's weird is putting them in the order that you do. Never mind that your usage of analepsy is entirely incorrect, and that you're trying to make it mean a different word, which is a strange kind of usage error, I suppose, or failure of memory. And maybe, analepsy, you're thinking of analysis. I don't know, like, which is to unravel and investigate, etymologically, maybe, and from ana, like thoroughly, and then the root of lucis, to loosen or to unravel. So like the unraveling of the plot, but I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure if that's the confusion, and Eric is saying, and but he says, like, but beyond that, what's interesting is that the anavasi that you use, it's more of a literal action than it is a kind of metaphorical ascension, which is what you mean in part 3. So in part 3, you're really better off using an analepsy if you wanted to put them in an order, but because what you're talking about in part 2, in part 1 you've got the motivation and the impetus. Like, I get that, And Othissi is fine for that, he says. So I'm listening to, and I'm kind of embarrassed and a bit ashamed. And he says, and what I don't understand is why you didn't just look it up. So Erica is saying, like, what I don't understand is why you didn't just look it up. And I said, I begin like to I begin to explain, or to justify myself by saying, that, I have very few, books left. I've lost my library, a number of different moments, and very, very, very little material here, and that that most of my books are packed right now because I'm in the process of moving, and that the internet doesn't really provide, very good information regarding, like all of these terms, and I may have, failed to do the work because, and I begin, to do this. It's like, well, what I don't, he says, what I really don't understand, is why, you persist in failing to recognize this distinction, between oral tellings and narratological engagements that belong to the work of memory, as it's expressed in verbal discourse, and the production and performance of recording, in which writing plays a substantial part, and that all of these clarifications could easily have been made prior to your articulation, and he goes on, and he says, so I get what you're doing. Let's just leave Othissi alone. Let's leave Othissi alone, because clearly each of the dreams, right, that the characters have provides a kind of thrust or impetus or motivation, for the action that determines the course of their relationship, to the unfolding of the plot. So I don't have any problem with that. And he says, and I understand, like, that you want each of the characters, right, to have a relationship with these three elements because of your argument about the divine feminine and the three forms of the goddess and the tripleus amaxitois, which you're also pronouncing wrong, it says. But I can't pronounce it the way that he did, so I'm just gonna leave it. But he does make a point about my mispronunciation of the crossroads. He says, okay, but the biggest problem is the confusion of this word analepsy, which is the ascension of Christ. That's the Greek word that they use to describe that. And he says, if you had written, if you had written it down, or you had, you had found like, an accurate and authentic, text, you could have made this clarification, and you're still relying on verbal memory of a language that you can barely pronounce to articulate these ideas, and this is one of the problems that you're having, but it's interesting. He said, like, why? So think about the difference between analepsy and anavasi in these ways. Like one is more action related, and you're using that one to describe a more metaphorical idea of transcendence, right? Like you're using climbing and anavasi like to describe like this ascent that belongs really to ascent of consciousness or stepping out. And what I would suggest is like a better way of looking at this feature that you're referring to as anavasi, or the way that you pronounce it is anavasi. But the way that I would look at it, and I can't remember how he pronounces these words, but Eric says is as ecstasis, more like a stepping out of oneself. Now I know that ecstasis, has all of these certain kind of connotation that that you might want to limit it with, but like there are other choices too. Like the word iperveno, he says, like going beyond or exceeding, and then that puts you in this domain of excess, and in a certain way, like it's also a reference to transgression, right? And that aspect of transgression does belong, to the divine feminine, and it puts you back in that domain of the liminal, right, and all of the border crossings. Iperveno is not a bad word, to describe this third part of a movement toward knowledge, that gets you away from this idea of ascent and this verticality that, may not belong, to the going beyond. Because who's to say that the going beyond isn't, entering, an underworld that is not an ascending but a descending. And do you really want, to put like that vertical semantics into this construct that you're organizing around, this challenge of like this singularity of identity? If it belongs to the divine feminine, it doesn't seem to me that you really want to reinscribe it in that way. And so in addition, like to getting like the idea of action and the idea of symbol, kind of backwards in the way that you perform the analepsy or organize the analepsy, which is just the wrong word for what you want in the first place, Eric says. And anabasy, which is okay for what you seem to be getting at in the second part. But any and then he gets a little frustrated, and Eric says, so whether you use anabasy for the third part, let's keep in abeyance the term that we're going to use for your second articulation of the way that this is organized. But whether you use anabasy or analepsy, that, and he pronounces it correctly. I'm not pronouncing it correctly, but Eric does. But whether you use either one of those, terms, one can't really help but think of this idea of apotheosis, and I don't think that's really what you have in mind, for any of these characters. Now, I know that you've stated, in parts of the discourse, that this last feature really applies, to those characters, specifically Diarmenia, Ctesiphonk, and Tiresias, both of whom have a relationship, to the divine feminine, and that it doesn't, so much apply to Laius and Oedipus, but nevertheless, it's going to be difficult, to utilize this term and not, right, and not see it in terms of this long tradition, right, of kind of patriarchal ascent, to the up the mountain, and you're utilizing it in this Greek cultural context, but your contemporary readers, are also going to see it in terms of this history of Judaic myth and story as well, and all of these ascents, all of these mountain voyages, and the symbolism that comes to us, through Romanticism of the symbol of the mountain, if you're talking about climbing and ascending, and there are mountains in Greek myth too, but the significant part of the heritage of that tradition, right, through the Romantics, right, belongs to all of these tellings in which prophets and holy men, belong to this tradition of this Jewish and Hebrew tradition that has to do with the encounter with the patriarchal God of the mountain. And so utilizing that word, and pointing it specifically, toward the two characters that represent the divine feminine is confusing. And that's why I would suggest something else. Like I really think that if you want to utilize a Greek word at all, and why would you really need to? But if you want to utilize these Greek terms, think about the idea of ecstasis, right? Ecstasis, and think about the idea of hyperveno, however Eric pronounces it. I can't pronounce it as well as he can, but this going beyond, or exceeding. In a way, a kind of transgression, a kind of parabasis, Eric says. All right, so I suggest, that, for the last two. And then this middle term that you have, like, okay, so each one of these characters, you say, is motivated or thrust, right? Into what? Well, they're thrust into some kind of action. And it seems to me that, you're talking in this central term, you really have two things going on. You have schedio, like scheme and plan, right? This Greek word schedio, like that comes from scheme or to plot, right? So there's a plotting and a planning, a schedio, and then there's an acting, like more like the work of the action hero, right? That the hero's journey. Joseph Campbell, that hack, and Eric, describes Joseph. I wouldn't describe Joseph Campbell as a hack, but Eric in the dream describes Joseph Campbell as a hack, and whether it's because he's jealous of Joseph Campbell's popularity, or because he sees what Campbell does in the hero's journey or 1001 Faces or whatever it's called, that as an oversimplification and abstraction of more complicated psychological forces that are actually at work, or so whether it's out of jealousy or whether it's out of critical engagement, with the work is uncertain, but he suggests that but what he's getting at, I think, in his slight, in his, Joseph Campbell slight, is that in Campbell, like, you still have this idea of like this man of action, right? It's the man of action that David Antin initially describes when he describes Oedipus's encounter with Laius at the Tripleus Amoxitois, right? And that he says, because for a Greek, if you encounter this guy at this road, at this crossroads, and he says, get the fuck out of the way, you're going to kill him. That's your job. You're the hero, right? And this is, in some ways, this action-based action figure model of the hero is in some ways, the same model that Joseph Campbell has in his 1001 Faced representation of this psychological adventure. And does it matter? Does it matter? At least this is how I was reading Havelock. Does it matter really, like, how this becomes an allegory of consciousness or not, if it's still based on this patriarchal model of the male action hero? And what he's suggesting, right, is that and he uses a Greek word. He says, so you could divide your second section up into these two parts, and one is schedio, and I can't pronounce it, the way that he does. I'm not good at that stuff. And then the second one, he says is drasi. Drasi is like action, right? Like the action hero, and that really belongs to Laius on the road, telling Oedipus to get out of his way, and Oedipus on the road refusing to do it, and action as in like the sequence of events, sometimes like the physical events that we imagine happening in the world, men of action, right? The war and all of that stuff, and then the other work, like the work of the apple of discord, like the planning, or even think about Macbeth, and it's weird because it's Eric Havelock, and you think he would only want to talk about, Greek stuff, but he talks about Macbeth. So you have like the action that occurs on this one level with Lady Macbeth in a certain sense, although she does belong to Schedio in a certain sense, but like if you think about like the witches and the cauldron, right? And how that cauldron, like symbolically, represents this idea of schedio and planning and plotting and the plot. And that's a kind of action too, but it's not a kind of like, heroic, patriarchal action like that you need like this stand-in figure like Macbeth, right, to operate. So you could say that by the time that he gets to Shakespeare, like that it's become gendered, and that schedio is split in terms of like these representational values that get attached to femininity as like scheming and plotting, and then part of that belongs to Lady Macbeth, although she's more masculine in a certain sense because she does implement certain kinds of action. But Hecate is in that play, as well. Or you could imagine that, that like even the representation of those witches around the cauldron are a form of Hecate, right? There's 3 of them, right? And so you can imagine like that they're not so much part of the action as they're part of the schedio, but right, they're also motivators, but not motivators in the same way that you're talking about in this Odyssey that you've got going. That's the impetus that belongs to the dream, right? There's a kind of like initial revelation. I get that, but then in the second part, then you have like someone has to step in and plan, right? So you could imagine like that the witches around the cauldron had an Odyssey as well. Like and whatever it was, whatever the inception of this plan was, then it had to be carried out. And carrying out the plot, developing the plot, that's part of schedio. But then the action required, to initiate the movement and the changes in the world. Like this is the part of the construct, right? Of cause and effect that someone like Joseph Campbell like inscribes in this patriarchal form, and that drasi, right, the action. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to take all of these threads and the way that they're woven in under the terms of patriarchy, and you're trying to like expose them. So you need more terms than the 3 terms that you have, and you've got to show like how this however many number of terms you have to show how they get woven in different ways for these characters that represent different relationships to the divine feminine and patriarchy. So like Eric goes, it's hard to keep track because this is all going on in your dream, and then when you wake up you have to remember it, right? And you have to reorganize it and think about it and try to make sense of what he's saying and remember how to pronounce the names right, and anyway, so he says, say you have the othisi. Let's just leave that, because he goes, I like that. That makes a lot of sense, right? But even in the othisi, you're going to have different relationships to these other terms. Like say that you have, right? Say that you have a schedule, a kind of scheme or planning, and say that you have a drasi, an action. Well, it's clear that like for different characters, like the schedule can have different relationships to the othisi. Like it seems like fairly self-apparent, right? That in Tiresias in the first set of dreams that Tiresias has, as they're recounted, right? In Aristophanes, like that this is some kind of revealing, right? But it also seems clear to me that there's an aspect of ecstasy in the dream, right? And that belongs to the seeing. That belongs like to the scopophilic pleasure that Tiresias experiences when they're having these revealings, and that belongs in a certain sense like to all the anxieties of returning to blindness. And so you could say that in this othisi, right? Ecstasy, it becomes part of the initial experience, but that's clearly not the case in Laius's dream. And then you haven't gotten to the recounting of the Sphinx's dream, but that's different still, and you'll see when you get to the dream of Diarmenia Sheshapunk that in her dream there's a lot of schedule going on, right? So that if you want to distribute these terms across one another, you can distribute schedule into the othisi when you get to Diarmenia Sheshapunk. But you clearly can't do that with the dreams that Tiresias has, because the dreams that they have, they seem to represent, ecstasis and ecstasis and ipraveno. I can't say it. Eric can say it. But the going beyond or the exceeding, already it's there. And what they're going beyond and exceeding, Eric says, is the limitations of their own physical condition as blind. But what they're also doing is exploring, the gender, the gender. The gender transgressiveness in the sense of going beyond and not having limitations. The transgressiveness or the conditions under which a binary construct of gender are limiting, right? Exceeding that. And that's the excess of the ipraveno. And that already belongs, for Tiresias, to the othisi. And so and then by the time that you get to the Sphinx, and I know you haven't gotten there yet, and if you talk about this tomorrow or the next day, I don't want to create a situation in which your memory forces you to spoil what you're going to do in the future by remembering what I said. But in a way, like, I still have to say it. Like when you get to the dream, the initial dream of Diarmenia Sheshapunk, if you don't see the schedule already existing in the way that dream unfolds to her, then you're missing an important part of the way that these various elements get distributed according to the nature of the characters, and that the figures themselves, you could say, represent different foldings of these principles. So I think that you can retain the idea of the three, and I know how important like this number 3 is becoming in the way that you're trying to articulate this form, but you can retain this by like threading these different terms, through the different characters. All right, Eric says. So think about it this way. Think about Tiresias in relationship to the idea of drasi, or action, right? In what meaningful way does Tiresias, do they engage in any physical action, right? And then Eric says you can hardly call walking to Laius' palace and engaging Laius in conversation and describing the events of a dream or the dream itself or stumbling off the stage as action, right? In any significant and meaningful kind of way. So the work, the labor of Tiresias, is all involved in the distribution of these other elements, of becoming a figuration of orthosy, of push, of impetus, of embodying the idea of schedule, of scheme and plan, and of the experience of ecstasis. And proveno. And for them, for Tiresias, there's no drasi, in any meaningful way. There's no action in that sense. So that one just drops out, right? But then, like, take a look at, compare them to what you're about to engage. Like, okay, in the next couple of days, you're going to be dealing with Act 2, Scene 2, and Act 2, Scene 3. And the way that you could look at Act 2, Scene 2, is pure schedule on the part of Laius, but it's already in action, because when he plans physically, like that's the whole point of the foot races, right? In Act 2, Scene 2, the whole point of the foot races is it's part of a plan. Like and the plan involves like acting upon like physically in the world. Not with discourse, but by sorting these potential soldiers. He's going to sort these potential soldiers according to a plan. But the sorting itself involves this foot race. So you could say, that Act 2, Scene 2 is an example of Seggio, and it's a plan, but it's very much like an action plan, right? Like that involves like the mechanics of like making these determinations based on physical skill and performance. And then once he has his team, right? And then Act 2, Scene 3. It's pure drasi. It completely fails, because he gets everything wrong. But this is classic physical male hero stuff. It's very Joseph Campbell, Eric says. Right? It's very much like that stuff that David Antin describes when he returns to that idea of Oedipus, facing Laius on the road, and he constantly goes back and says, before a Greek, before a Greek, before a Greek, before a Greek, and that's just one part of being a Greek, right? But that part really gets reified. That action figure Joseph Campbell stuff, it really got reified. And maybe because people weren't paying close enough attention to the text, or maybe they paid too much attention to a particular reading of a particular text, Eric says. But in any case, like Act 2, Scene 3, right? It's all action. And what's interesting about it is that the schedule, the plan, completely falls apart. And so does the othecy, the push, the impetus, the motivation, like that established the whole thing, collapses, right? And you never get to, like Forlaeus, of course, because he's like the opposite of the divine feminine, right? You never get to the ecstasis or the upraveno. And then in Act 3, Scene 1, you still have the othecy, you still have the impetus in the dream. But if you read the dream that the Sphinx has of Diomenia Chesapeake, if you read that dream in Freudian terms, Eric says, and I know you haven't gotten there yet, but you have to think about this. When you do get there, if you read that dream in Freudian terms, and not just simply, as coming from the spirit realm, and advice from her brother, but if you read it in those terms, then you have to admit that part of the schedule is already being played out in the dream itself, right? And that there is, like I suggested, that maybe in your usage error and your misuse of this word, analepsy, which I mentioned, that's the Greek word for the ascension of Christ, and somehow you're using it to describe, embarking on action, and as a part of the construction of the plot. But if you follow my suggestion that you may have some part of your unconscious mind may have been confusing that word with analysis, the Greek word analysis. I unravel, I investigate, I thoroughly unloosen. Like if that was the motivation in this weird sort of like language error, that isn't even it isn't even a parapraxis, Eric says, because it's so far, from it's so far from meaning anything that seems to be recognizable as what a substitute term, could be utilized here. It's not even a parapraxis, but whatever kind of the error that is, maybe it was motivated by some relationship of this word, in your understanding to the word analysis, and what that might have meant in relationship to this like unfolding. But even if that were the case, he says you still need to unravel the distinction between the relationship to analysis as part of the schedule and this idea of action, right? Or action or undertaking that you want to associate with the crossroads and the options available to you at the crossroads, but also the symbolic values that are represented by the crossroads, right? So by the time you get to the dream of Diomenia Chesapeake, right, you can see that in the impetus and the motivation, for her to change the deal that she made with Tiresias, they have a kind of contract, but she's not going to honor it. But you can see that in the dream that she has, that there's already a working through of the schedule, of the scheme and the plan. The scheme and the plan. And then by the time you get to Act 3, Scene 2, and Diomenia Chesapeake's encounter with Oedipus, you can say, well, that's where the action occurs, right? But what's the action? What's the action for the Sphinx? What's the action for Diomede or Chesapeake? Well, it's not really action. The action itself is telling the riddles, right? That's the action. There's no action, there's no action of murder and destruction and a conflict like you see with Oedipus and Laius, Eric says. The action is the verbal discourse itself. And the struggle, the encounter, the conflict is the verbal discourse. And whether, Oedipus can solve Diomede or Chesapeake's riddles, or whether Diomede can solve Oedipus's riddles. That's the action, and that's the conflict. And so you can see that in that action belongs more clearly to schedule, to scheme, and to plan, and to plotting as plot, than it does, to physical exchanges in the world, right? Like lifting heavy stones or throwing stones, or whether someone can win in a foot race, or win in a physical encounter. And think about this too. Isn't there an aspect of ecstasy in the Sphinx's telling of the riddles? She really enjoys telling these riddles. It's an ecstasy of the mind in a certain sense, right? The trance of the riddle, and the mesmerism of the riddle itself, a form of magic, really, a form of magic and cognition, and the creative imagination, and the gymnastics of the mind, that create these expressions of flow and energy that relate to this idea of iperbeno and ecstasies. So that's how that gets distributed there. And then, if you keep all of this in mind, it'll help you articulate the distinctions between the characters even further. And that doesn't really get in the way of your three-part division. But you have to think about it in a different. You have to reorganize it in your head. Think about it in a different way, if you really want to have an accurate depiction of what's going on in the Aristophanes version of this story, And so it's not just about reorganizing the elements of the plot, and keeping track of what happens in Act 1, Scene 1 through 3, or what happens in Act 3, 1 through 3, or what happens in here, and like whether you got the whether you got the telling right, in terms of the way that it's organized in space and time, and whether your three-part schema works or not. But it's about like distributing like a more complex set of values across those values that you recognize to begin with, so that you can more clearly articulate to yourself, the roles of the four important separate characters, and how in a way that's perhaps more complex and interesting than what you initially provided. It still gets at that idea, of the distinction, between between a universe, organized around a set of patriarchal understandings and values, and a world, organized around a set of mysteries. And transgressions, right? Of those patriarchal, one could say, delineations. Domain as a set of confining features, right? And so Eric is going on and on and on, and there's a lot that I've left out. There's a lot that I've left out, and since we're making a list of errors and coming, and trying to think about, maybe why different kinds of errors occur, and how and how the making of errors, result from different, kinds of functions of the mind. We can talk about, another reason, that I can't remember all of Eric's advice and the way that, he organized, some of the suggestions. But that belongs to the fact that, that all of this occurred in a dream. And unless you, get up, unless you have a pad and a paper, and as soon as you have a dream, and you keep that pad and paper, by your side in your bed, which I don't, but if you do, and then you wake up and you have a vivid memory of this dream and you write it all down, and Eric would appreciate this, and you write it all down, then and then you'll have a record of it, and then that'll serve as an aid to memory, and you'll remember it. But if you don't do that, dreams fade, and they fade even more quickly than ordinary waking memory fades, for whatever reason that is. Maybe it's because the material that they wanted to bring to us, whether that's wish fulfillment material or anxiety material, that they wanted to bring that to consciousness, but in some way consciousness wants to reject it, and it does so by forgetting. Maybe that's one reason, or maybe there are other reasons that just have to do with the cognitive modalities of different brain lengths, different brain wavelengths, and some are easier to retain in memory, and some are more difficult, and it makes sense, right? But for whatever reason, unless you keep that little piece of paper or wax tablet, by your side when you're doing the dreaming, then it fades, and that's perhaps one of the reasons why I can't hardly remember, right now. Even if I had to perform this discourse all over again, just in the time that it's taken me to articulate it, already I'm forgetting what Eric said and the corrections that he made, and regarding like the various mistakes in my discussion so far. I'm already forgetting it. And a lot of that, forgetting has to do with where the remembered material comes from. And in this case, the remembered material comes from a dream. And that's why it's hard to put together. And that's why it lacks a certain amount of clarity. But hopefully it's enough, and it's enough to establish the context in which we'll be moving on, and attempting to relate the events as David remembers them and reads them and interprets them and elaborates them, from whether it's from his memory of what Aristotle has to say about Aristophanes, or whether it's directly from his memory of what Aristotle says in the drama as it's written down, as it's written down in the text, or as he remembers it from his viewings of it, as it's presented in presumably very different forms and using various different strategies than it would have been presented in on the ancient Greek stage. But if he's seen it, if he's seen the smile of the Sphinx, and it seems that he has, because he often describes the details of the stage set and the way that things unfold visually. It seems that he's seen it, but it's possible that he's only imagined it, and he's imagined it as if he's seen it, but he's imagined it from a text. It's possible. And we can speculate. We can speculate, that perhaps it's a combination. And it would be possible for us to speculate, like all of this different points of David Antin's, discourse and argument, and elaboration of this story, this story as it's put together, textually by the author Aristophanes, for the production on stage, but realized somewhere. And we could speculate, moment by moment in the discourse. Is he remembering it, from the text here? Or is he remembering it from a memory of its presentation on stage here? And was that presentation on stage accurate? And accurate according to what? According to the text? Or according to a historical understanding of what the Greek stage might have been at that moment? But we can reify our speculations, and we can present them, as a narrative, or we could even perform them on stage. We could re-perform, David's discourse, and we could have certain characters stand in, and when he's telling a certain point of his telling, the David Antin, whoever's playing the part of David Antin could step to the side, and characters could come in and they could narrate, this part of the story, or three Marys could come in and narrate that part of the story. Or if there's a moment, that he's drawing, upon from a dream, we could represent that in a different way. But as I pointed out, there's certain things that are missing because the Romans burned Alexander's library. But the Romans are always burning Alexander's library. In a certain sense, the burning of Alexander's library, can be regarded as a metaphor, for mind and memory. And since the Romans are always burning Alexander's library for one reason or another, because there's something that you don't want to remember, or there's something you want to take credit for that you're not really responsible for, like being the best culture, right? Or having all these great ideas. Like I said, who knows? Who knows whether Ovid, invented that all of those sons of Somnos or Hypnos, or whether they were already there, whether they were always already there in the Smile of the Sphinx, most of which copies got burned by the Romans when they burned Alexander's library at Alexandria, named after Alexander. So when we return, we'll do the best, that we can, to reconstitute, what we know or speculate, metaphorically, right? Belong to that library, and to reconstitute our reading, elaboration, and interpretation of David Antin's reading, elaboration, and interpretation of Aristotle's reading, elaboration, and interpretation of Aristophanes' reading, elaboration, and interpretation of the story of the Smile of the Sphinx, in terms that take into account Eric A. Havelock's reading, elaboration, and interpretation of what we've done so far, and why we've committed the errors that we have, and what we can do with those errors, now that we've recognized them.